Good evening, good evening. We're just going to give people a moment to join. We're live now on YouTube. We are live on Zoom. We're going to be live on a few Facebook pages in a moment. I just found out amazing news. I found out that there's something called the World Series tonight, and that I'm competing with the Philadelphia, with people in Pennsylvania and Texas. Verstehst? But I'm not in a spoil. I'm not going to fall apart. We're going to see who chooses Torah over. Good evening, Danielle. Good evening, Mick.
My grandfather used to say. My grandfather used to say, "Verstehst du meise?"
Verstehst du meise? Do you imagine? I have to compete with. I'm competing with the base. Good evening, Jane. I'm competing with baseball players, but we're going to teach them a lesson. They could also learn this lesson. Because it's Parshas Lech Lecha. It's the third portion in the book of Genesis. Good evening, Eric.
That's
Yeah. That's our son's Parsha.
Lech Lecha. There you go. You see? Now I'm going to mute everyone. There you go. Okay. Hi, excuse me. Good evening, Erica in Norway. Good to see you. Good evening, Penny. Nice to see you, Pnina. Okay, I got a bunch of books in me because it makes you look like a scholar. If you pile up books in front of you, you look like you're professional. No, jokes aside, I just have a couple of references. I wanted to have the actual text in front of me, and we're going to get rolling. So it is Parshas Lech Lecha. Good evening, Kayla Gittel. It is the third portion of the book of Genesis. We read about, it's really our first introduction to Abraham. Before his name was even Abraham, his name was Abram at this point. And we read a couple times in the Parsha where God is telling Abraham about the fact that the land of Israel was going to be his. Something so fundamental to so many conversations. I've shared with you before that every time I would travel to Washington, D.C. for the AIPAC convention, it would not only make my blood boil, it would break my heart that you're in a room with 3,000, 4,000. One year there was 17,000 people, mostly Jews, some Gentiles, in love and support of Israel. And yet I never heard anyone standing at the microphone ever saying, by the way, this is a land that has belonged to the Jews since the days of Abraham, 4,000 years. It was always 67, 73, 48, 1833. Zion is this and Zion is that. Hello. You want to get your message across, you got to tell people the truth that we've been associated with this land from the days that God gave it to Abraham. So where did God give it to Abraham? In our Parsha. So there's a couple of spots in the Parsha. First, God tells Abraham to go to the land of Israel. And then God tells him, I'm just pulling up the specific verse. So God tells Abraham, after he's separating from his nephew Lot, when they get back to Israel from Egypt, God said to Abraham, after Lot had parted from him, please raise your eyes, and from the place where you are positioned, look northward, southward, eastward, and westward, because I will give all the land that you see to you, to your descendants for eternity. So, one reference. Then God says to him, Kum hisalech ba'aretz la'arkal rachba. God tells him, get up and walk through the land, across the length and its breadth, for I'm going to give it to you. So that's the second reference that God is telling Abraham. Then you have in verse 7, actually before that, I must have missed it. Yep. So it said, hold on. Yeah. Verse 7, right in the beginning of the Torah portion, it says, God appeared to Abraham and he said, I will give this land to your descendants. And right there, when Abraham got the news that he was going to get this part of the land, he's going to get this land, Abraham built an altar to God who had appeared to him. It was a great godly revelation, and Abraham builds an altar to God. And then, so here's already 3 mentions of the land of Israel. Oop, I need to let someone in. Here's already 3 mentions of the land of Israel, where God is telling Abraham that this is going to be his land 3 times already. And we haven't even gotten to the actual formal covenant that took place later in the Parsha, because later in the Parsha, this all goes down in our Parsha. Towards the end of the Parsha, Abram says to God, and it's a little bit of a chutzpah, he says to God, God, Almighty God, give me a sign through which I can know that I will inherit it. So God already told him 3 times in the parsha that he's going to get the land of Israel. And according to the Medrash, Abram was slightly rebuked or punished for this question, but he asks God, give me some proof. What is a sign that I'm actually going to merit to inherit the land? So God says to him, take from me 3 heifers, 3 goats, 3 rams, a turtle dove, and a young bird, and cut them in half. It was called the bris bein hapsarim, right? The covenant of the parts. Back in those days, they would make covenants by cutting animals in half and then walking in between. And it was a sign that the wholesomeness comes from both sides being together. And so Abraham did what Hashem said, and he went into a deep sleep. And then God tells him, you know, your descendants will be strangers in a land that's not theirs, meaning they're going to go to Egypt. And then he says later, by Yoimahu, on that day, God struck a covenant with Avram, saying, I've given this land to your descendants from the river of Egypt until the great river, the river of Euphrates, so all the way up to the Euphrates River. And he says to him that he's going to give it to, but he doesn't say he's going to give it. He says, L'zarach nasati, I have given the land. I have given the land. God is telling Abraham 4,000 years ago that he's already given the land to Abraham's descendants. Grammatically, it seems a little off. How is he telling Abraham that he gave it already to his descendants? It sounds cute. Oh, it's all covered already. I got you covered. Your descendants are covered. But God is precise. And if God tells Abraham that he gave it to his descendants, there has to be a reason for that. Now, I want to read for you. I figured, why do I have to go in circles? Why don't you guys are an intelligent group of people. I know that because I sit with you every week, and I don't sit with unintelligent people. You guys are intelligent. And so, especially you, Chagai. So I want to read to you from the Rambam, Maimonides. So the Rambam in 2 different locations, and I'm reading this because I think once I read it, you'll have an understanding of, you'll be able to understand what I'm about to share with you from a Farbrengen of the Rebbe that was primarily shared in the fall of 1963. That's the summer and the fall of 1963. So the Rambam says as follows. The Rambam's talking about the laws of Truma. Truma is the gift that we are obligated to give biblically to a Kohen. So when we're in the land of Israel, when you have grain or wine, or flour, or you have oil, you have to give a percentage, and it's not the scope of tonight's class to talk about what that number is, but you have to give a percentage to the Kohen, just like you have to give tithing to the Levites. You have to give truma, which means a contribution, but you have to give an amount to the Kohen. The Talmud discusses what's considered a good amount, but here's what the Rambam says. When we talk about that you have to give from the land of Israel, what is Israel? Who makes up the borders? So he says Israel is the land conquered by any king of Israel or judge or prophet with the majority of the Jews. But if a family goes and conquers a piece of land on their own without the majority of the Jews led by a prophet, king, or judge on their own, it's not considered legally, halachically, Jewishly as part of Israel, even if it's part of the original land that God gave Abraham. In other words, the mitzvahs that are connected to the land of Israel only apply to parts of the land that God gave Abraham that was inherited by the majority of the Jewish people as a nation led by a king, prophet, or judge. Because otherwise it's all a mishmash. Every family that parks themselves in some part of the general area of Israel will have their own laws. Then he says as follows. There was the kibush rishon and the kibush sheni. And I'm using the words of the Rambam, even though today kibush in Hebrew is translated as occupying. That's not what he means. He means the conquering, the inhabiting. I labeled tonight's class on purpose just for shock value. I labeled it, is Israel occupied? Because I knew it's going to get people on YouTube to watch it, and then they'll find out a big surprise that Israel's not occupied. But there is a difference in when we inherited which part of the land of Israel and what our obligations are with that particular part of the land. So this may be news to you, but then again, that's the point of the class, to learn new things. So the Rambam says as follows: any part of Israel that was held, that was conquered by those that came from Egypt, which means the generation that left Egypt spent 40 years in the desert and then were led into the land of Israel by Joshua, and it was sanctified with the first sanctification when the Jews came in with Joshua. Here, listen closely. Kevan Shagalu, once the Jews were exiled, so when the Babylonians destroyed the temple and we were thrown out of the land of Israel, we were exiled, Batla Kedushasan, the holiness that became part and parcel of the land when Joshua led the Jews as a whole into Israel was now nullified. It was not holy like that anymore, which means the mitzvahs that you would be obligated to do, when you're in the Holy Land, like tithing, like truma, like sabbatical year, they wouldn't apply once the Jews were exiled from the land of Israel after the first sanctification that happened with Joshua. Why? Because it did not have longevity. After the exile arcs, after the Jews who went into exile, remember, so Nebuchadnezzar exiled the Jews, destroyed the first temple. So the temple that was built by Solomon was destroyed 410 years later by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. And Nebuzaradan, his wicked general, and he took the Jews, the majority of them, he took them into Golus Bavel, the exile of Babylon. And then the Babylonians were conquered by the Medians, and the Medians were conquered by the Persians. That's where the story of Purim took place. Always the trick question they would ask us as kids: which holiday came first, Purim or Hanukkah? And you ask a Jewish kid growing up in an Orthodox community, which holiday came first, Purim or Hanukkah? And naturally the kid thinks, well, whichever one comes first in the year. So we'd always say Hanukkah, and it was a trick question, because of course Purim happened during the Persian exile, and Hanukkah happened during the era of the Second Temple, which came later. So the Persians take over, and then there's Xerxes, Achashverosh, the story of Purim takes place, and then Ezra and Nehemiah, Nehemiah, led by the men of the Great Assembly, including Mordechai Abalshon, which was Mordechai from the story of Purim. Ezra leads the Jewish people back into Eretz Yisrael. And when they came to Israel, Ezra, when the Persian king Cyrus gave them permission and his blessings to go back to Jerusalem and build the temple, to build the second temple, they sanctified it a second time, and that sanctification remains forever, not just at that time, but for all eternity. And even the places that were only sanctified in the days of Joshua, which is called the first sanctification, we're still obligated to give the holy objects, the holy gifts and the tithings, because we wanted to make sure that poor people got what they needed. So if you followed what I said, the first sanctification with Joshua was only temporary until, as long as they were living in the land. The longevity, the long-term sanctification happened by Ezra and Nehemiah. The second time they conquered, the second time they inherited and sat and lived in the land of Israel. And the Rambam says something very similar in the laws of Beis HaBchira, the laws of building the temple. And I want to quote, he says that only after Ezra went with the Jews and settled in Israel, not conquered Israel, but settled, and this is very key, only then did it become holy to the point that it never becomes unholy again. But why? Right? It's a good question. What's the difference between what happened when Joshua conquered the land to when Ezra conquered the land, when Ezra went to settle in Israel? What's the difference with this group of Jews or that group of Jews? On the contrary, Joshua was one of the greatest leaders and prophets of the Jewish people. He was a judge. The first book, he was a student of Moses. He was the second in command. He took over from Moses. Why, when he conquered Israel, did they not merit to have all the mitzvahs, for all eternity, but only after Ezra, who some say wasn't even a prophet, he was just a leader of the Jewish people, that Ezra, along with Nehemiah, with Nehemiah, they come to Israel, and suddenly we have this eternal holiness that lasts forever. So I'm going to share, there's many explanations to explain the difference. I'm going to share with you two of them, and then we're going to get to the Rebbe's point of all of this. So one interpretation is from the Tosfos Yontif, one of the commentators on the Mishnah. He says that when Joshua conquered the land and got rid of all the nations that were living in Israel, the nations living in Israel and around Israel, so the Middle Eastern nations, did not approve of the Jews being there. Sounds familiar? They did not approve of the Jews being there, but when Ezra went with Cyrus's blessing to settle in the land of Israel, it was a chazakah. They settled and they had a permanence there, and they had the blessing of Cyrus. So the Gentile nation, Cyrus was the superpower of the time. You know, their superpowers, by the way, I think maybe America should take note. Superpowers don't last forever. Babylonians, Medians, Persians, like Romans, Greeks, they flip quickly. So the superpower of the time, which was Persia, supported Ezra going into the land of Israel, which means the nations of the world supported it. So the Achronim say that was good. There's another approach to it that says, and this is from the Radbaz, one of the commentators on the Rambam, he says the difference is that when Joshua went into the land of Israel, it was all about war. They conquered, occupation. Ezra didn't occupy. He came in, there was no one there fighting him. He took up chunks of land in the land of Israel. Right? With Joshua, there was Sheva Shanim Shekavshu, 7 years for conquering and 7 years for splitting up the land. When Ezra went into Israel, because it came with the blessings of Cyrus, there was no war, there was no battle. We took land, we settled, we became farmers, we became builders, we became operators in the land of Israel, and therefore, it remained for all eternity. Now, I want you to take all that information and go back to the original verses in our Torah portion about Abraham in the land of Israel. If you look closely to the verses, you'll see that in all the verses where God tells Abraham that he's going to get the land of Israel, he uses the term L'cha etnana. I will give it to you as a gift. Etnana from the word matana, as a gift. Or L'zaracha eten et haaretz hazot. To your descendants I will give, I shall give this land. But then later, by the covenant of the parts, by the Bris Ben Absarim, he says, L'zaracha nosati, to your descendants I have given this land. And that was the one that was in response to Abraham asking a question about Me'er Roshana, how will I know that I've inherited it? Give me a sign that I would know that I've inherited it. So the Rogatchover, the great Rabbi Yosef Rosen, says that Israel was given to the Jews. Israel was given to the Jews both as a gift and as an inheritance. What's the difference between the two? Even a person giving a gift, it says, people don't give gifts if they don't have a benefit of joy of giving that person a gift. But at the end of the day, I have to make a choice to give them a gift. They have no right to a gift. You can't come to your friend and demand a birthday present. I mean, you could, but you'll just be an idiot. You don't demand a present. A present, by definition, is I am giving you something that I believe you should have, that I want you to have, but it's me giving it to you. And yes, I may get pleasure from it, but your opinion about it or your demand for it has no legalities, has no legal ground. You have no legal grounds to demand the present. Inheritance, on the other hand, if you are, there's hundreds of pages of Jewish law of halacha and the Talmud for sure about the laws of Yerusha, the laws of inheritance, of how a child or a sibling or a spouse, all the laws of inheritance associated with that, and what is legally theirs by definition because they're a child or a spouse, etc., and what isn't. So it's not just a gift that I'm such a kind-hearted person, I'm going to give you an inheritance. An inheritance is something you get because you have a connection to that person that is so deep that whether they want to give it to you or not, you may be earning that inheritance no matter what. When the Jews went into Israel the first time, they conquered it. They fought. They were an occupying force. Now, they were coming to take a piece of land that God had promised to Abraham, but at the same time, right then at that time, there were 7 massive nations, the 7 nations that God said to eradicate. And actually, Israel was divided into 31 kingdoms, 31 provincial kingdoms in the land of Israel that had to be conquered by Joshua, and he succeeded in doing so. But it was done by brute force. So yes, it was ours, and we took ownership of it. We took bailus over it, and when we took control of it, we did merit the gift that was ours. But just like a gift is given to you, whether you want it, whether you can't demand it, but it's a gift to you, it's thrown upon you. You have no right to it, it's given to you. We took Israel just like that, because God said so, and God wanted us to go through the process of conquering it. But the holiness of it was dependent or conditional on the fact that we conquered it. Had we not succeeded in the wars of conquering it, we would never be able to experience the holiness of the land and the mitzvahs associated with the holiness of the land. And therefore, once we were exiled from the land, the mitzvahs that were associated with the land, the holiness associated with the land, went along with it, because we took it by force. And when you take something by force, you can get ownership, but you can't get the inherent bond that you're looking for with a location, with God's full support and the people around you's full understanding that it belongs to you, because you took it by force. I want to be clear. I'm not talking about defending the land of Israel from enemies. There's no greater sanctification of God's name than when the Jewish people, Israeli soldiers, men and women, defend their country from the enemies who are trying to take away the land from the Jews and put Jewish lives in danger. That's not a question here. Because first of all, Ezra conquered the land of Israel over 2,000 years ago, over almost 2,500 years ago. And his conquering was done the way it should be done, meaning he did it by settling it with chazakah and not by occupying it. And therefore, he revealed something. That's why God told Abraham that I have given it to your descendants, given it to my descendants. When the Jews came with Ezra, they were coming to inherit the land. And God's telling Abraham 1,000 years, 1,500 years before that, he says, listen, when they come to inherit the land, when they're finally going to get to a state of Yerusha, they're going to be inheriting, not getting a gift, but inheriting it because it's rightfully theirs, because I already promised it to Abraham. They're going to look at the land and say, oh yeah, it was already given as a gift. When was it already given as a gift? It was given as a gift when Joshua took in the land. That's when they already occupied it as a gift. Now we are coming with Ezra and we are inheriting that which is rightfully ours, but we're not doing it by brute force. We're doing it by settling, just sitting in the land and living there. And therefore the holiness associated with that goes back to its original holiness, which is going to be there for all eternity, because we did it in the way it should be done. Now, of course, it came through exile. We had to go into exile first and get to that state, but we did it. And once we got there was no going back, which is a fascinating concept. So here you have a situation where Joshua can lead the Jews into Israel because it was done as an occupying force, as a conquering force, versus just settling in a land that had no opposition. It created a different reality for all eternity as it relates to the holiness and the mitzvahs connected to the land while we're living there, because there's a difference between an inheritance and a gift. God wanted Joshua to lead the Jews into Israel as conquerors. In other words, which means the Jews have to recognize that there's other people living there and they have to fight for it. He wanted us to go through the process of fighting for it. But because it came in that, tell her to turn off the microwave quickly. The microwave, Shoshana. Turn it off quickly. Quickly. Thank you. My microwave knocks off my Wi-Fi. Welcome to 2022. It does it to you too? Okay, good. Therefore, after they went into exile and after they come back to the land of Israel, now we're going into Israel not as a conqueror, not as an occupier, but we're going into Israel as an inheritor. And because we got it as an inheritor, we show, when you inherit something, it shows that you have an inherent connection to the one who came before you. So by settling there casually, oh yeah, Cyrus told us to go to the land of Israel, we settled, and yes, oh, why do we have this land? Oh, because God gave it to Abraham. Sort of matter-of-factly. Then we keep that holiness for all eternity. And it really represents a different approach in how we deal with life and how we deal with the land of Israel. You know, generally in the world, there's in Jewish life, there's two paths. Obviously, you'll say, what do you mean 2 paths? Just me and my sister will have 8 paths. What do you mean 2 paths? But no, in generally, as Jews, there's we divide the Jews into 2 groups. There's the righteous, the tzaddikim, and then there's Bali Tshuva, those who have had sins and they've repented, they've returned to God. Which one's holier? A tzaddik. He never sinned. She never sinned. Right? They don't really interact with the world. They don't get sucked into the realities of the world. They sort of come into the world in their little bubble and they shower their part of the world with holiness, with mitzvahs and Torah study, but they're not really embedding themselves in the world. They're sort of like an occupying force in the world. You can't change a society by being an occupier. I think the UN calls that apartheid, which is a rule that only applies to Jews when they're in their inherent land, but we'll save that for a different class. For those that don't know me long enough, I just want you to know I'm being sarcastic. Right? A tzaddik, a righteous Jew who's in their own, they're experiencing hermetism, they're in their own spiritual bubble, they come into the land like Joshua came into the land. We are conquering the land. We're occupying the land. We don't want to interact with the land. There's enemies in the land. We're going to get rid of it. We're going to shower the world with holiness and hope that it sticks. Chances are slim that it will, but it doesn't matter because I'm not really interacting with the world. Then you have a Baal Tshuva. What's a Baal Tshuva? So they may not be as inherently holy as the tzaddik, but boy, do they reach a place of holiness through their work that puts the tzaddik to shame. Because for the Baal Tshuva, it comes bottoms up. They're working through the greatest challenges. I've said this 1,000 times. What do I know about eating bacon? I never had it. It means it's like telling me, Rabbi, you don't know what you're missing when you eat a leather chair. That's how interesting bacon sounds to me. I never had a leather chair for dinner. I never had bacon for dinner. Rabbi, you have no idea what you're missing with a cheeseburger. You're right. I also don't know what it's like to eat a wax candle because I never tried it. So to be a Baal Tshuva means I know what bacon tastes like, and you could say, Rabbi, there's nothing in the world like shrimp. It's amazing. And I'll say, your shrimp has nothing on my gefilte fish. And you'll say, Rabbi, you're crazy. I've had gefilte fish. Shrimp is way better. But because I've discovered my relationship with Hashem, I will never eat shrimp again. That Baal Tshuva in that moment reaches a place of godliness and holiness that not only conquers the world or occupies the world with holiness, it settles the world with holiness. It permeates the world with holiness. Because this is not a person that's not familiar with the world. This is a person that knows the world and is bringing such a deep level of holiness and transforming the world. So we're not forcing. You can't force holiness on people. You know those people that throw rocks on people because they're driving cars on Shabbos in Israel? Psychopaths. What are you throwing boxes? First time I saw it in my life, I was 16 and a half years old. I saw a taxi driver driving to Geula, which is a very super duper ultra orthodox fundamentalist. I'm just using all the New York Times titles. It's an orthodox community and they have no idea. No one ever trained them with the Torah's view of how to interact with a Jew who may not be religious. So this taxi guy made a mistake. He made a wrong turn. And I was watching kids throwing cardboard boxes. And I literally, 16 and a half years old, I came from New York. It was Shavuos. I looked at these guys, said, out of your mind? You're throwing boxes on the guy? What did he do wrong to you? He's not in your way. So I waved to the guy and I said, Chag Sameach, which means good yontif, happy holiday. And then they looked at me like I was from Mars because I looked religious and yet I was interacting with this guy like a nice person, right? Because you can't force spirituality or holiness on people by brute force. It doesn't work. It may get your agenda, right? You may succeed getting your agenda across, but if you're looking to permeate those lives and the world around you with holiness, it will never work because you're an occupying force. If you want to change their lives, if you want to make Bali Tshuva, if you want to show people to find God, it has to come in a form of not occupying, but settle. And then you settle, and casually you share with them, and casually they start changing their lives, and casually they're transforming the greatest depth of sin into the greatest place of holiness. Joshua had to do what he had to do. In that moment, we needed a tzaddik approach. The Jews that came out of Egypt, certainly the ones that survived the desert and were still alive, they didn't die with the spies, they didn't die with the sin of the golden calf, they didn't die with the snakes, they didn't die with any of that. That means they were the righteous ones. They went into Israel. They came from a place, they were living in the desert in a spiritual utopia. They were 100% hermits. They came into Israel. The only language they knew was occupation. They had to bombard Israel with holiness because they didn't know anything else. They were tzaddikim. And that kind of holiness only lasts as long as you are an occupying force and you stay there. The minute they left, done. No more holiness, no more meiser, no more tithing, no more shemitah, because you're gone, so the holiness is gone because you came in with your force. Maybe force that you had to do, but that's what it was. When Ezra came, the Jews had just been through the story of Purim. They had struggled with sin, right? Remember, they went to the party of Achashverosh. So Jews were now dealing with the real struggles of life. And yet, it says, by the way, in the days of Ezra, the vast majority of Jews in the land of Israel were intermarried. And Ezra came and he made a whole revolution to get them to leave their non-Jewish wives. And it was a great time. It ended up being a great spiritual revolution, but he didn't do it by force. He did it by influence. He didn't use power. He used influence, because he understood that we need to settle, not occupy the land. And when we approach our world today, Rabbi, what are we going to do about this immoral thing or that immoral thing? A whole day, everyone's coming up with new immorality to brainwash us with, to hack us at China, to twist our minds and think that things that are totally abnormal are somehow normal. And the things that we know are normal, they try to convince us it's not normal. And how do you deal with that? How do you keep up with that? Not by screaming at people, not by barking at people, not by putting nasty signs in your front yard or on the trunk of your car. You do it by settling, with talking and inspiring and influencing, with sweetness and with holiness, so that you can allow them to embed Yerusha, that they can start seeing Judaism as their inheritance too. Not just as a gift that you're shoving into their face. Here's my birthday present, take it whether you like it or not. And unwrap it later when I'm not here. And then you open up the box and you find out the guy gave you leftover birthday present that he got 3 years ago. Come on, you all smile. How many times have you gotten a gift and you're pretty certain the guy wrapped up a gift that someone gave them 3 years ago and they're passing it on like Shalach Manas? That's not. You want every Jew to see Judaism as their inheritance. And for them to see it as an inheritance, you have to live like Judaism is your inheritance. It's a beautiful thing that's given to you because of who you are in relationship to God, and you celebrate it. You recognize its holiness. You recognize how delicate and sensitive it is, and you share it with the world in a way that it can settle with them in their hearts, in their minds, in their bodies, until we merit the time when even the UN, may their names be erased, even the UN, the Shoyim Arurim, the wicked, evil UN, even they will realize that we're not an occupying force in Israel. Maybe we were between the days of Joshua and the second and the destruction of the first temple. But once Ezra took over, we weren't occupiers, we weren't conquerors. We came back to settle a beautiful land that God had given 1,500 years earlier to our beloved Abraham and to his beloved wife Sarah. And Abraham and Sarah walked the land to the width and to the length. And God said, "Yup, you see this land, this little land from the whole world. God could have given them Australia, right? A little bigger than Israel. For heaven's sake, he could have given them North Carolina. It would still be bigger than Israel. But he gave them exactly the land that they needed. And when we recognize it and we treat it with the respect that it deserves, being a land of God, and we take ownership of it the way Ezra did, then we merit its holiness, not just temporarily, but permanently, until we merit the ultimate holiness, the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu. When, yes, believe it or not, this is not a political statement I'm about to say, because I don't say politics. There will be a third temple in Jerusalem, and no, it will not be built by Itamar Ben-Gvir, and it's not going to be built by Bezalel Smotrich or Bibi or all the people that are busy with Israeli power. They're not going to build the third temple. The only ones that are going to build, the only one who's going to build the third temple is going to be Mashiach Tzidkenu. Until then, we're going to have to stick it out in exile, but that will come. And it will come a lot quicker than the world thinks, when we'll merit the utopian peace, when we won't have to worry about if Jew-hating parties will be in the Israeli government or not. People that hate us and want us annihilated should be part of our government in the land of Israel, because they won't be our enemies anymore, because the world will be a world of peace, a world of tranquility, with a beautiful temple on the mountaintop in Jerusalem, the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu, May it be speedily in our days. Amen. Have a rockin' week, a rockin' day, a rockin' evening. You have to say something, Zizi? Zizi wants to say hi?
Hi.
Zizi's checking in, and we will see you back here soon. Sei gesund. Also, Shana, she can use the microwave again. Let me.
This meeting is being